Number 10. Zhang. Some generals become legendary because they commanded vast campaigns across many years. Others become legendary because a single moment burns so brightly that it seems to swallow the rest of their life. Zhang Liao belongs to that second category. A general of the late Eastern Han and Three Kingdoms era, he is remembered above all for the Battle of Hefei, where a relatively small defending force under his command struck with such force and precision that it shattered the confidence of a much larger enemy army. That alone would have been enough to secure a place in military history. But what transformed Zhang Liao into something closer to legend was the way later memory treated that victory, not just as a clever battlefield success, but as proof of almost terrifying personal daring. The image that survives is unnervingly cinematic. A commander facing overwhelming odds, riding out aggressively rather than waiting passively behind defenses, cutting into the enemy at exactly the moment fear could spread fastest and turning discipline into psychological warfare. In stories that followed, Zhang Liao becomes more than a capable officer. He becomes the kind of figure whose presence alone seems to alter the emotional atmosphere of battle. That matters, because history often remembers great generals not only by tactics, but by aura. Once a commander begins to feel larger than calculation, legend is already beginning. What makes Zhang Liao especially fitting for this list is that the historical man and the remembered figure do not sit neatly together. The records preserve a respected and formidable general, but later tradition, especially through retelling and literary culture, cast him in a harder, brighter light. He becomes fearless, nearly unstoppable, a man whose nerve under pressure made others seem ordinary by comparison. This is how military memory often works. A real victory becomes a symbol. The symbol hardens into character, and the character slowly becomes mythic. In that transition, the person begins to vanish behind the legend created by his finest hour. There is also something darker in the way such generals are remembered. Zhang Liao served amid one of the most fractured and violent periods in Chinese history, where loyalties shifted, regimes rose and fell, and survival often depended on attaching oneself to unstable centers of power. A man could win immortal fame and still remain caught inside a world that gave no lasting peace. That instability adds to the sense of mystery. A victorious general does not step into a secure, heroic ending. He remains inside a landscape of warlords, collapsing authority, and endless campaigns, where triumph feels real but never final. And that is why Zhang Liao belongs here at number 10. He won a battle so memorably that later generations treated it as more than battle, almost as revelation. Yet the clearer and brighter that martial image became, the harder it was to see the ordinary contours of the man behind it. History preserved him, but legend consumed him. What remains is a commander who seems to emerge in a flash of impossible battlefield control and then recede into the deeper haze of the era, less like a fully graspable historical figure and more like a warning about what one fearless general can do when timing, violence, and reputation collide. Number 9. Prince Sviatoslav of Kiev. Some generals vanish into legend because later storytellers enlarge their victories. Others vanish because the life itself already feels like a legend before the storytellers even begin. Prince Sviatoslav of Kiev belongs to that second kind. He was not merely a ruler who commanded armies from afar. He was remembered as a warrior prince who seemed to live permanently in motion, campaigning across vast distances, striking enemies with ferocious speed, and carrying himself with a blunt martial simplicity that made him feel less like a courtly monarch and more like a figure dragged straight out of epic tradition. Even before death turned him into memory, he already seemed halfway between history and saga. That is part of what makes him so compelling. Sviatoslav's campaigns against neighboring powers, including the Khazars and the Bulgarians, gave him the image of a ruler who expanded by force and lived through war almost as a personal element. Later accounts emphasize his toughness, austerity, and refusal of softness, qualities that fit perfectly into the mythic template of the warrior, who belongs more naturally in camps and river expeditions than in palaces. In such cases, legend does not need to invent an entirely new person. It only needs to sharpen the existing outlines until the historical man begins to look superhuman. But what truly pushes Sviatoslav into darker memory is the way his story ends. After years of war and ambition, his death does not arrive in the peaceful dignity of an old ruler. It comes violently, in an ambush by the Pechenegs, at a moment that feels brutally fitting for a man so bound to conflict. The ending matters because history often seals legend through the final image. A warrior who dies in ordinary retirement can still be admired, but a warrior cut down in motion, in danger, and in the wake of unfinished ambitions becomes something else. He begins to feel like a life that could only conclude through violence. That violent ending also gave later memory exactly what it needed to deepen the mystery around him. The more dramatic the death, the easier it becomes for a culture to reinterpret the entire life through that final scene. Sviatoslav ceases to be only a prince who fought wars. He becomes the embodiment of a harsh, heroic world, one in which power is seized through steel, borders shift through raids and campaigns, and rulers live close enough to danger that death remains almost a companion rather than a surprise. This is why figures like him linger so strongly. They do not represent stable kingship. They represent an older and more unsettling image of leadership as permanent exposure to war. And that is why Prince Sviatoslav of Kiev takes the number 9 spot. He won wars, broke rivals, and stamped his name across one of the most turbulent regions of medieval Eurasia. But he did so in a way that made his whole existence feel raw, mobile, and half mythic. By the time later generations looked back at him, the transformation was almost complete. The prince had become the warrior had become the legend, and the legend had absorbed much of the man. What remains is not only a successful commander, but a figure who seems to ride through history like a storm, vivid for a moment, then gone, leaving behind fear, admiration, and the sense that some victors are remembered less as rulers than as forces of war themselves. Number 8. Themistocles. Some generals become legendary because they dominate the battlefield through sheer violence. Others become legendary because they see the shape of victory before anyone else does. Themistocles belongs to that second kind. He is remembered as the mind behind one of the most decisive turns in ancient history, the naval strategy that helped save the Greek world during the Persian Wars, especially at Salamis. His genius was not only military in the narrow sense, it was psychological, political, and almost theatrical. He understood fear, timing, terrain, and the weaknesses of great empires. He knew that a smaller force could survive if it forced the enemy into the wrong kind of battle. And when that vision worked, it did more than win a war. It changed civilizational memory. That is what makes Themistocles so fascinating. He does not feel like a simple battlefield commander with a sword in hand. He feels like one of those rarer and more dangerous figures who can read history as if it was still unfinished. At Salamis, later memory casts him as the man who understood that numbers alone would not decide the outcome. Space, confusion, confidence, and manipulation would matter more. The Persian Empire came in with immense power, but Themistocles helped turn that power into a liability by shaping the conditions under which it had to fight. In that sense, his victory always carries a slightly eerie quality. It feels less like brute force and more like a trap closing at exactly the right moment. But what pushes him fully into the realm of this list is what happened afterward. Themistocles did not settle into secure glory. He became entangled in the same unstable political world he had helped preserve. Rivalries, suspicion, shifting loyalties, and the bitterness of public life eventually drove him into exile. And from there, the story becomes darker and stranger. The man who had helped defend Greece from Persia ended up connected, in one of history's great ironies, to the Persian world itself. That reversal gives his memory a haunting quality. A savior of one civilization seems to drift into the shadow of the empire he once outwitted. This is where legend begins to take hold. A commander wins one of the most important wars of his age, then does not remain anchored inside the triumph. Instead, he slips sideways into political danger, displacement, and ambiguity. The more dramatic the victory, the more unsettling the aftermath feels. Themistocles becomes difficult to place neatly inside patriotic memory because his life refuses a clean ending. He is too brilliant to forget, too complicated to simplify, and too politically dangerous to fit easily into a comfortable heroic mold. That is often how mystery grows around great men. Not because nothing is known, but because what is known refuses to resolve cleanly. And that is why Themistocles belongs at number 8. He helped win a war that shaped the future of the ancient world, yet his own life ended not in secure honor, but in distance, tension, and historical irony. The strategist who could read an empire and trap a fleet could not escape the instability of human politics. In the end, he feels less like a neatly finished hero and more like one of history's great exiled minds, a general statesman who saved a world and then vanished into the uneasy borderland between triumph and alienation. That shadowed ending is exactly what turns victory into legend. Number 7. Skanderbeg. Some generals are remembered because they commanded enormous empires. Others are remembered because they stood against them and somehow refused to disappear. Skanderbeg belongs to that second category. Emerging in the 15th century as the leader of Albanian resistance against the Ottoman Empire, he became legendary not only for military skill, but for endurance. Again and again, he is remembered as the commander who held out, the warrior who made a smaller mountain land feel unconquerable, the figure who turned resistance itself into a kind of battlefield identity. Against a vast and expanding imperial power, that kind of record does not remain ordinary for long. It begins to glow with something mythic. That mythic quality comes partly from the setting. Skanderbeg's story is not just about armies clashing in open fields. It is about strongholds, rough terrain, sudden reversals, and a defender's war fought with intelligence, mobility, and relentless will. Those ingredients are perfect for legend. Mountains create mystery. Repeated resistance creates aura, and when one commander becomes the face of that resistance, he starts to seem larger than the political world around him. Skanderbeg was a real historical leader, but later memory increasingly treats him as more than that. He becomes the shield of a people, the embodiment of defiance, almost the human shape of a frontier that refused submission. What makes him especially fitting for this list is that his life carries the feeling of return and transformation. Taken young into the Ottoman sphere and later breaking away from it, Skanderbeg's story already has the structure of epic reversal built into it. A man shaped by one imperial system turns against it and becomes the defender of another identity altogether. That kind of narrative is almost destined to become legendary because it speaks not only to war but to reclamation. It gives later generations a hero who does not merely fight well. He returns from power, rejects it, and stands against it. That is far more potent than a simple military resume. And yet, as with so many figures on this list, victory does not resolve into peace. Skanderbeg wins, resists, survives, and becomes unforgettable, but the world around him remains unstable and dangerous. His legend grows not because he founded some permanent calm, but because he seemed to hold collapse at bay through force of character and command. That is one of the darkest and most fascinating patterns in the history of generals. Sometimes the greatest military figures are not the ones who build lasting order. They are the ones who become symbols of refusal in moments when order is failing. Their immortality comes from holding the line against inevitability, even if only for a time. And that is why Skanderbeg stands at number 7. He won battles, defied empire, and left behind a memory far greater than the scale of the territory he defended. Over time, the military commander and the national legend fused together so completely that separating them became almost impossible. What remains is a figure of iron resistance, a general who seems to ride permanently along the edge between history and heroic myth. He did not just fight wars, he became one of those rare men whose name survives as a fortress in itself. Number 6. Arminius. Some generals become legendary because they conquer foreign lands. Others become legendary because they stop an empire at the exact moment it seems unstoppable. Arminius belongs to that second kind. Known most famously for the destruction of 3 Roman legions in the Teutoburg forest, he occupies one of the strangest positions in military memory. He was shaped in part by Rome, trained within its orbit, familiar with its methods, and then turned that knowledge back against it with devastating effect. That reversal is one of the reasons his story feels so powerful. He was not simply an outsider resisting imperial force. He was a man who understood the machine from within and chose the perfect place to break it. The setting matters enormously. Teutoburg is remembered not as a clean battlefield under open sky, but as a forested trap, wet, enclosed, confusing, and hostile to Roman order. The legions, so terrifying in formation, were dragged into terrain where discipline became harder to maintain and certainty began to rot into panic. In later memory, Arminius almost merges with that landscape. He becomes not just the commander of an ambush, but the intelligence of the forest itself. The figure who made the land and the war cooperate against one of the greatest military systems in the ancient world. That is how legend begins. Victory ceases to look merely tactical and starts to feel elemental. What makes Arminius especially compelling is the way his historical importance and legendary status feed each other. The Roman defeat was real enough, catastrophic enough, and psychologically shattering enough to secure his place in history. But later generations did not leave him there. They turned him into something larger, a symbol of resistance, identity, and liberation, especially in periods that needed a heroic ancestor standing against outside domination. This is one of the great transformations of military memory. A successful commander becomes a representative of a people, and once that happens, the man himself begins to recede behind what he is made to mean. Yet his real life was not the simple heroic arc that legend prefers. After the great victory, Arminius did not step into a stable throne of triumph. He remained caught in rivalries, tribal politics, and a world where personal power could be as dangerous as foreign invasion. In the end, he was not destroyed by a Roman army in glorious final combat, but reportedly by internal enemies, men close enough to see him not as a myth, but as a threat. That ending is darker, and in many ways, more revealing. History's great war leaders are often undone not by the empire they resisted, but by the unstable human world around them. And that is why Arminius belongs here at number 6. He won one of the most famous victories against Rome, changed the course of military history, and then vanished not into peaceful honor, but into a haze of political fragility and later myth-making. The more his name was elevated as a symbol, the harder it became to recover the full man beneath it. What remains is a figure moving through forest, betrayal and memory all at once, a commander who shattered an empire's confidence and then slipped into that darker realm where history no longer preserves only facts, but powerful ancestral shadows. Number 5. Yi Sun Sin. Some generals become legendary because they seem fearless in battle. Others become legendary because they continue winning even when defeat appears almost certain, as if ordinary collapse simply does not apply to them. Yi Sun Sin belongs to that second category. The great Korean admiral of the Imjin War is remembered not merely for competence, but for a level of resilience and command so extraordinary that it feels almost unreal when viewed from a distance. He fought under invasion, under political suspicion, under material pressure, and at times under conditions that should have broken any lesser commander. Yet again and again, he returned to the sea and turned crisis into victory. That is what gives Yi Sun Sin such an almost mythic aura. His greatest victories are not remembered as lucky moments. they are remembered as demonstrations of absolute composure under impossible circumstances. Most famously, the idea of holding the line with only a handful of ships against a vastly larger Japanese fleet has become one of those military images that border on legend, even though the historical achievement itself was astonishing enough. Later memory sees not just an admiral maneuvering effectively, but a man standing in calm defiance against chaos, using terrain, timing, discipline, and psychological force to make the impossible seem methodical. What pushes him even further into legend is the tragic structure of his life. Yi was not simply a celebrated commander honored without interruption by the system he served. He also endured arrest, demotion, suspicion, and the kind of political betrayal that so often shadows genuinely exceptional figures. That tension deepens his story dramatically. A nation under attack possesses a commander capable of saving it at sea, and yet that same commander is humiliated and endangered by internal distrust. This is exactly the kind of contradiction that produces enduring legend. The hero is not only great, he is great despite the blindness of the people above him. His death seals that transformation. Mortally wounded during the final stages of war, Yi Sun-sin is remembered through one of the most haunting last images in military history, the commander who does not want the battle or the morale of his men disrupted by the news of his own fall. Whether retold with perfect wording or not, the atmosphere of that ending is powerful enough to carry him permanently beyond ordinary biography. He does not simply die, he dies in command, at the edge of victory, already halfway transformed into the kind of figure later generations cannot remember without reverence. And that is why Yi Sun-sin takes the number 5 spot. He won wars, preserved a kingdom's survival at sea, and left behind a record so extraordinary that history alone seems almost too small a container for it. Over time, the admiral became more than a military leader. He became a moral and national symbol, the embodiment of disciplined courage under betrayal, invasion, and overwhelming odds. That is the point where a general begins to vanish into legend. The facts remain, but they are no longer enough. The man becomes a standard, a memory too powerful to stay merely human. Number 4. Subutai. Some generals become legendary because they win one famous battle. Others become legendary because they seem to win everywhere, across such immense distances and against such different enemies that their careers begin to feel almost unreal. Subutai belongs to that second category. As one of the greatest commanders of the Mongol Empire, he did not simply serve in a single frontier war or defend one kingdom in crisis. He helped shape campaigns that stretched across continents, smashing armies in wildly different terrains, and proving again and again that speed, coordination, deception, and patience could destroy forces that looked stronger on paper. The scale alone pushes him toward legend. Few commanders in history seem to move through so much of the known world with such relentless effectiveness. That is part of what makes Subutai so unsettling as a historical figure. He does not fit the romantic image of the warrior general who triumphs through personal heroic display at the front line. His genius feels colder than that. He is remembered as a planner of vast movements, a master of feigned retreat, encirclement, multi-front timing, and long-range operational design. In later memory, this gives him an almost inhuman aura. He seems less like a man reacting to battle and more like a mind arranging collapse from a distance. Entire armies march into ruin because he has already anticipated how they will think, where they will move, and how fear will spread when their lines begin to bend. What pushes him even further into the realm of legend is the way his victories are scattered across such a wide geography that they resist ordinary narrative containment. A general who dominates one region can be remembered as great. A general whose shadow seems to pass from the steppes into Eastern Europe, from one shattered coalition to another ruined kingdom, becomes harder to imagine as a normal person at all. This is one of the strange effects of military scale. The larger the field of victory, the more abstract and mythic the commander can become. Subutai starts to feel less like an individual and more like the moving intelligence of an empire that never seems to arrive too late. And yet that is also why he becomes mysterious. The more enormous the campaigns, the easier it is for the man himself to disappear behind them. The Mongol war machine was so vast, so feared, and so transformative that individual commanders inside it are often remembered in flashes rather than in intimate detail. Subutai becomes a name attached to a pattern of near-impossible success, but the human texture behind that success feels distant. He is there in the victories, in the planning, in the destruction of armies, but he remains hard to hold on to as a person. This is exactly how historical giants vanish into legend. Their achievements are so overwhelming that the individual dissolves into the scale of what he helped create. And that is why Subutai stands at number 4. He won wars on a continental scale and helped turn Mongol expansion into one of the most terrifying military phenomena in history. But the more he succeeds, the more he seems to recede behind a larger and darker image, not merely a commander, but a force of calculated movement and empire-wide annihilation. History remembers him because it has to. Legend takes over because ordinary memory is not enough. Number 3. Khalid ibn al-Walid. Some generals become legendary because they survive impossible battles. Others become legendary because, after enough victories, they begin to feel protected by something beyond ordinary fortune. Khalid ibn al-Walid belongs to that second kind. One of the most formidable commanders of the early Islamic conquests, he built a reputation so extraordinary that later generations struggled to remember him in purely human terms. His campaigns across Arabia, Iraq, and Syria, his speed of movement, his decisiveness, and his repeated success against stronger or more established enemies all contributed to an image that felt larger than strategy alone. He was not remembered simply as skilled. He was remembered as unstoppable. That sense of inevitability is central to his legend. A great commander can win many battles and still remain a historical figure. But once people begin to speak of him as though defeat itself could not easily reach him, something changes. Khalid's reputation hardened around precisely that kind of aura. He became the kind of military leader whose appearance on the battlefield seemed to alter expectation before combat had even fully begun. In such cases, tactics matter, but reputation becomes a weapon too. Enemies fear the name. Followers draw confidence from it. The general starts to command not only armies, but the emotional atmosphere around war. What makes Khalid especially fitting for this list is the tension between that immense martial reputation and the way his life ended. For a man remembered with such battlefield ferocity, there is something deeply haunting about the fact that he did not die in the dramatic combat one might expect from legend. Later tradition preserves the powerful irony of a commander who had faced so many dangers and yet died away from the glorious battlefield death that seemed almost destined for him. That contrast gives his memory a strange emotional force. It is as though history refused to give the legend the ending everyone anticipated, and that refusal only made the legend stronger. There is also a deeper layer to his memory. Khalid is not remembered only as a destroyer of armies. He is remembered as a commander tied to a world-changing expansion, a man whose victories were woven into the birth of a new political and religious order. That gives his military fame an added intensity. He is not simply a brilliant captain serving a kingdom. He becomes part of sacred and civilizational memory, and once that happens, the line between commander and emblem begins to fade. The historical man is still there, but he increasingly stands for something larger than himself: conquest, destiny, faith, transformation, and divine favor as later memory understood it. And that is why Khalid ibn al-Walid takes the number 3 spot. He won wars, broke enemies, and accumulated such a fearsome record that the ordinary language of military success begins to feel too small for him. Yet his human end, so different from the death one would expect for such a figure, leaves behind a final mystery that deepens rather than weakens the legend. What remains is a commander remembered not only for what he did, but for the almost supernatural certainty with which later generations felt his presence in history. Number 2. Belisarius. Some generals become legendary because they build empires. Others become legendary because they seem to hold collapsing worlds together by force of intelligence alone. Belisarius belongs to that second category. Serving under Emperor Justinian in the Byzantine Empire, he is remembered as one of those rare commanders whose campaigns feel almost impossibly elegant when viewed from a distance. He fought Persians, Vandals, and Ostrogoths, often with limited resources, unstable political backing, and strategic conditions that should have produced stalemate or failure. Yet again and again, he turned discipline, deception, mobility, and timing into victories that seemed larger than the means available to him. That is one of the first signs of legend. A general begins to look less like a servant of power and more like the fragile genius keeping power alive. What makes Belisarius especially compelling is the strange contrast at the center of his career. He won wars that mattered enormously to imperial ambition, helping recover lost territories and restore, at least briefly, the image of Roman greatness. Yet he never fully escapes the shadow of the court. For all his brilliance, he remains tied to an emperor whose trust could be uncertain and a political environment where extraordinary success could inspire as much suspicion as gratitude. This tension gives his story its haunting quality. The more necessary the general becomes, the more dangerous his greatness appears to the world above him. That pattern is one of the oldest and darkest in military history. A commander saves the state, only to discover that states are often deeply uneasy with the men who save them. Belisarius fits that pattern almost too perfectly. Later memory, especially in the centuries that followed, became fascinated not only with his victories, but with the idea of his ingratitude rewarded fate. The brilliant servant diminished, mistrusted, or symbolically cast down after all he had done. Even where legend embroidered the details beyond strict fact, the emotional truth was powerful enough to survive. People wanted to remember him not merely as a victor, but as a victor touched by injustice. This is where Belisarius begins to vanish into legend. The real commander, capable, disciplined, patient, politically constrained, starts to merge with a larger symbolic figure. The loyal general betrayed by power, the brilliant restorer who never fully possessed the world he defended, the man whose victories glow against a backdrop of imperial coldness. Once that transformation happens, the historical record alone no longer contains him. He becomes an argument about greatness itself, about whether states deserve the men who rescue them, and about how often genius is left isolated after triumph. And that is why Belisarius stands at number 2. He won wars that reshaped the Mediterranean world and secured one of the most formidable military reputations of late antiquity. But what lingers most is not simply conquest. It is the strange sadness around his greatness, the feeling that a commander so exceptional never stepped into a clean, heroic ending. Instead, he drifted into that darker realm where victory, suspicion, loyalty, and memory blur together. Belisarius survives not only as a general, but as one of history's most haunting examples of a man too brilliant to be forgotten and too politically exposed to remain untouched by legend. Number 1. Hannibal Barca. Some generals become legendary because they won enough battles to earn admiration. Others become legendary because even in defeat they remain more unforgettable than most victors. Hannibal Barca belongs to that second and rarer category. The Carthaginian commander who led an army and most famously war elephants across the Alps into Italy has survived in historical memory with a force almost unmatched by any military figure of the ancient world. His victories at Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and especially Cannae were so extraordinary that they stopped being merely successes and became permanent points of reference in the history of warfare itself. That alone would have made him immortal. But Hannibal's legend grew even darker and stronger because his story never resolves into simple triumph. That is part of what makes him feel so mysterious. He was brilliant enough to terrify Rome at the height of its rise, daring enough to carry war directly into the heart of the enemy's world, and gifted enough to produce tactical masterpieces that later generations still study with awe. Yet the larger arc of his life is marked by incompletion. He wins battles that should have broken weaker states, but Rome endures. He becomes the great nightmare of a civilization, but not its conqueror. That tension creates one of the most powerful kinds of legend, the legend of the man who came terrifyingly close to changing history forever, and, by falling short, became even more haunting. Hannibal also belongs at the top of this list because he seems to move through memory as both historical commander and symbolic force. Roman writers feared him, later strategists revered him, and modern audiences still encounter him as if he were more than a man, almost a personification of military genius fused with relentless will. The march across the Alps alone helped create that aura. It is one of those moments where history already feels cinematic before myth even touches it. A commander brings an army through terrain that seems impossible, appears where no one expects him, and then begins tearing apart armies of a rising superpower. The story is so dramatic that legend hardly needs to alter it. It only needs to preserve the emotional temperature. Yet Hannibal's later life deepens the mystery rather than resolving it. After the great campaigns, he does not settle into the simple glory one might expect for such a figure. He moves through defeat, political struggle, exile, and the long shadow of Roman pursuit. The man who once made Rome tremble becomes a hunted presence in the wider Mediterranean world. That reversal matters. It transforms him from a victorious invader into something more tragic and enduring, a commander whose genius outlived his state's ability to translate battlefield brilliance into final success. History often remembers such figures most intensely because they leave behind possibility as much as achievement. They force later generations to imagine the road not taken, and that is why Hannibal Barca takes the #1 spot. He won wars, or at least the battles that make wars tremble, and then vanished into one of the deepest legends military history has ever produced. The man survives in the record, but the aura around him has long since grown larger than biography. He is remembered as Rome's greatest enemy, as one of history's supreme tactical minds, and as a figure whose very name crossed from history into dread. Some generals win and are remembered. Hannibal did something stranger. He threatened the future so profoundly that even without final victory, he became immortal.